person talking about love, thine brother is the preacher. And it seems nobody's interested in learning but the teacher.
What's up, guys? This is Jaron with Savage Gym. Today I'm answering a question I got on Facebook from Justin Raymond. Justin wanted to know, with a program that he's running, it asked him to perform box squats, and he was curious as to which variation that I thought would be best, as well as any technical cues that would be helpful for him as he implements them into his program. Now, I'm assuming, Justin, that you are a raw lifter. If you are not, then I'm probably not going to be your best source of information, since I only coach raw lifters and I don't have any experience with, single or multiply gear. However, if you are raw, then there are different ways for you to maximize the use of a box squat. One of the first things that I would recommend is really looking at the reason behind using a box squat in your program. I'm not going to go into too much detail as to whether or not that's going to be an effective variation for you. We're just going to address the program as it's written and talk about the movement and ways that you can make it better and work better for you and your specific weaknesses or imbalances or anything like that. The reason I say this is because I don't rely too heavily on box squats for raw lifters. I find that a lot of the benefits that you can get from box squatting, you can get to a greater degree using something like a pause squat or other variations. And so I don't use them a whole lot, but there are a couple main variations that I do use in specific circumstances to address specific weaknesses with people that I coach. However, this is not something that is used over a very long amount of time. I only use these variations, or most of these variations, to address the weakness or the technique flaw. Once we've corrected that, I plug that back into just a regular free squat or some other variation thereof. So kind of let that be the preface for everything that I'm about to say. If after hearing all of this, that still sounds like a good variation for you, awesome, and hopefully the rest of this information will help you maximize that movement in your current training program. The three main variations that we use here at the gym are going to be just your traditional wide stance, kind of pseudo west side style box squat. These are typically done, like I said, in a very wide stance. This is obviously limited based on what your personal hip mobility and structure is, but usually almost as wide of a stance as we can kind of manage. We want to exaggerate the amount that you're sitting back into your hips, because this is going to be a completely posterior chain driven squat variation. So without the box, you should not be able to squat this way without the use of supportive gear, which is why, again, this is kind of used in very specific circumstances. The benefits of using this variation are the, pretty much primary stress is placed on the glutes, hamstrings, and back. Very, very posterior chain driven. And so I've found that this variation is helpful for sumo deadlifters, and we'll use it to add additional training volume to the hips without necessarily stressing the back quite as much, using something like a sumo block pull. So we would train, their main movement, and then I would utilize this as a secondary movement or as an accessory movement to help give additional training stimulus for the hips. Another reason that I might use this variation is somebody who is very quad dominant, and I'm wanting to take their quads out of their squat to the greatest degree possible. And so in that extra wide stance with the very large sit back, we're really minimizing the amount of help that we can get from the quads in the squat. And so I've found that that helps for people with that particular strength imbalance, and it also helps to build up some flexibility in through the hamstrings. So for someone whose hamstrings are tight, they possibly sit at a desk all day long, having that exaggerated sit back in that stance makes it easier for them to open up the hips and emphasize the glutes and the hamstrings. The second version that I use is more of a traditional stance squat. So this is going to be whatever your normal squat stance is, but done to a box. And so based on the person and the situation, we may or may not actually pause your weight on the box. We may also even just squat to the box, but this is done in just a regular squat stance. Now, the main reason that I use this, and I use it mostly with beginners, is to, again, cue that ability to sit back into the hips. That's something that most people tend to struggle with, and they don't know how to control their balance while they're sitting back into the hips, and they don't know how to control the knees staying in position to keep the hips open. And then when you add the bar onto the back, there's a bunch of other things that can go wrong. And so if you look at one of my earlier videos about how to pick your squat style, or how to learn the squat from a more corrective perspective versus a performance perspective, I kind of break down the progression that I use to teach the squat pattern. But to kind of cover that briefly, if you want more information, I'll provide a link to that video below. I use that so that I can progressively teach the different cues that we're going to pay attention to in the squat pattern. So what to do with your feet, how to create tension in through the hips, how to brace the core, and how to keep all of that tight as we're focusing on sitting back into the hips. And I've just found that having that box there as a source of kind of tactile feedback helps people to learn where to sit into their hips. It gets rid of the fear of falling, and it also allows you to really focus on driving from the glutes and from the hamstrings as you're coming up out of the squat. And 9 times out of 10, if I teach someone how to squat that way first, by the time I take the box away, we've fixed most of the technique flaws that we usually have to struggle with teaching a new person or a new lifter how to squat. And so that's the main reason that I'll use that variation, is to kind of just teach that motor pattern. Another reason that I'll use just a regular stance box squat or a squat to a box would be to teach someone proper depth. This is not always the best way to do it, but quite often if I have someone sit down to a box that we set to be at or slightly below parallel, just having that little bit of feedback from touching your butt down to the box seems to be good enough for them to kind of learn where that bottom position is. This works well. Sometimes for some people, just doing a pause squat seems to work better, but that would be another way that I implement that squat variation. And lastly, and I very rarely use it for this purpose anymore, is to learn speed and power out of the hole. I've really found that a pause squat works better for that, but that was one of the reasons that I had used it in the past, but I don't feel like it's the best for that. Another variation that we've been using lately is something that I got from watching George Lehman, which is a deadlift stance box squat. This works both for sumo and conventional pullers. Sumo pullers, I would have use that extra wide stance that we talked about first. Conventional pullers would use something with the pretty much identical stance as your conventional deadlift. I set the box either at or slightly above parallel, just a little bit. Then we keep the feet and everything pointing, not straight forward, but they're very close together. And the goal with this, or the reason that George Lehman uses these, is to work on that leg drive and that power out of the bottom of a conventional deadlift. And I've been using these for about 8 weeks, and I'm having some really good success with that. So that's a newer variation that I don't have quite as much experience with, but at least in the last couple months, I've seen some good results from that. And it's also helped to be a really good supplemental variation for building up quad strength for me. I have very long femurs and I tend to be more hip dominant in most of the things that I do, and so my quads tend to be the weak point for conventional deadlifts and also in my squat. So using that variation really helps to emphasize the quads, and I've been seeing some good results with that. So that would be another variation that we would use. So those are kind of the 3 main variations of box squats that we use here at the gym. Swapping out for a straight bar versus a safety squat bar is mainly going to be based on whether you have access to one. So if you don't have one, then that simplifies that right there. But also what your weak points are, or if you have any history of injuries, or if you have shoulder mobility issues or anything like that. I use the safety squat bar personally because my elbows tend to get a little bit grizzled from low bar squatting. And so for my secondary squat day, I squat on my deadlift day. I'm using the safety squat bar just to put extra emphasis on my upper back and my core, which we'll talk about in a second. but also to just get rid of that additional stressor to the shoulder girdle and to the elbows, because I also have to bench, you know, in the same week and not be in pain all the time. So using the safety squat bar allows you to just have the bar rest on you without the requirements of bringing the elbows back on that additional stress. Buffalo bar would help with this as well. The main reason that I use a safety squat bar is because it feels like you're being drop kicked in the back of the head when you're at the bottom of the squat. And so there's a great demand for strength in your upper back and in through your core. And so in addition to any of the benefits that we get from those different box squat variations that we already talked about, you get the added benefit of learning how to stay more upright in the squat, how to keep your core braced, how to build strength in through your upper back, how to remain tight even though you're in a loose position with your hands. And so if those are things that you struggle with, or if you tend to fall forward in your squat, or if your back tends to round on a deadlift, then maybe swapping some of these variations or performing any of them with the safety squat bar might be a good option for you. If that isn't a weak point for you, or you don't have access to it, then don't really worry about it. You don't need specialty equipment to progress on your program, although it is helpful for solving certain problems for certain people. So to kind of recap all of this, if we look at what your potential weak points are and how to pick a variation for you, if you tend to have weak hips and a weak posterior chain, then we may want to look at a wider stance box squat. If you tend to have bad squat technique, or your knees tend to shoot forward, you have trouble sitting back into the hips or maintaining tightness, or you tend to squat high, then maybe using just a regular squat stance, squat either to a box or with a slight pause at the box, may be a good option for you. And if you tend to have a weaker upper back and weaker core, and you tend to fall over, then you may want to look at doing any of these variations with the safety squat bar. That's about it. If there's anything that I didn't cover that you still had questions on, feel free to shoot me another message and I will make a better video, or at least an amended version of that. If not, I hope this has been helpful.